I know we're at the end of quite a long day, but I think it's worth taking a moment to take stock of the conversation we've been having, especially since I want to talk to you about listening. I think it would be a bit contradictory not to share with you the listening I've been doing today to all of you. And there are things that everybody has said in the different sessions that have really resonated with me, and I think speak to the kind of project I've been trying to develop, especially in this book that I've just written on the politics of listening. So I'm just going to say one line, more or less, from each of the sessions, and then try to connect that to my own work as best I can, and not in more than 15 minutes, so we can all still concentrate. So first of all, I wanted to say to Mellow, because I consider your intervention as an intervention as well, that there were so many things you said with your beautiful voice. But I think one thing that really struck me, because I want to talk about listening as solidarity, is when you talked about the problem of becoming microcosms of things we say we're going to fight, and finding ourselves becoming judgmental and reproducing exactly what we say we're critiquing, which is something I hope we can come back to, especially in our roundtable discussion. Lory, also of the beautiful voice, especially your final words to us, that you, we are the spirit of resistance and here to stay. And that, I think, is what we're trying to cultivate today. Gretchen and Jeannette, I thought really their invisibility, you both highlighted so well. This idea around the ancestors and generations and what we do now, what you were saying, what I do now, affecting 7 generations from now. We've got the past, in the present, and in the future. And the invisibility, of course, of the Danish colonial past and the American colonial past. And what I want to add to that discussion is the Canadian colonial past, because that's the story I would like to tell you about today. Ambrose and Divya. Well, first of all, Ambrose, the fundamental importance of a full sound check. And I think both of you, the power of the story, storytelling, Divya, as a form of activism. And I think, Kajal, you spoke about this after in your comment just now as well, about taking to task the stories we're told about grand narratives around multiculturalism, for instance. That's really important in Canada. It's really important in this country as well. About breaking out of identity brackets. When we talk about politics of listening, that's exactly what we need to be thinking about. What dominant norms of intelligibility are in place that make people heard on some terms and not on others. And reclaiming narratives for ourselves. I think, Ambrose, it was really striking looking at those images you showed us where people were expressing themselves on the pavement and others just sort of walking over the words. And I thought, well, what listening happens there? I'm not saying that it doesn't, but literally people's feet are going over those words as they go through the city centre to shop. So how then do we say things that otherwise aren't talked about, and how can we be heard when we're saying those things? Gavin and Kajal, both of you, I thought, in very interesting ways were talking about privilege, especially, Kajal, when you talked about the work you're doing now about time, about the time of those who labor for others and the absence of time. And again, that makes me reflect on our privilege to sit here today, to have this time, however difficult it has been to wrench it out of our schedules, to have this opportunity to speak to each other in these ways. And Gavin, I think you were talking about privilege also in terms of the way that might be leveraged to make wider social justice claims through intersectional activism. And that's something, again, that I think bears reflection. And finally, Allah said so many things to us, but I think there, again, it's about telling stories and how stories can be heard. And I think a theme running through a lot of the interventions today has been around complexity. And what I would like us to think about as well is, well, what space is there for that kind of complexity? When she was talking to us not just about portraying victims, about showing people in their complexity, showing what also makes people happy, showing not fetishizing people according to one dimension of, let's say, an identity bracket that may resonate, that may be very audible to us, but then we need to be questioning why. We need to be questioning what kind of politics underlies that audibility. And instead moving beyond those kinds of one-dimensional stories. And I just want to thank all of you for all of those kinds of points, which I've drawn very selectively just because of how they resonated with me. And what I just want to share with you in this brief time is how I came to be thinking about listening, and then to talk a little bit about, especially the case of a moment, I would say, of listening as solidarity. In the case of solidarity action between migrant justice activists in Canada and some Indigenous groups, and to think about what that kind of listening as solidarity can look like. And I'm sure you all have your own experiences and examples that will maybe contradict or complement this kind of account. So in terms of, for me, why did I start thinking about listening as such and the politics of listening, it was really when I was doing some work in France on completely unrelated things, where for several years I had the opportunity to do emergency outreach work with homeless people, with migrants of different legal statuses. And a lot of that work was in areas that had been affected by what are called in French émeutes, riots, and were again very soon to be affected by these uprisings again. And what struck me, and this resonates so strongly with all of these stories we've been telling about reclaiming narratives, is the way people in the French have acronyms for everything. I don't know if there's anybody French here, but there's always an acronym. They call them zones urbaines sensibles, sensitive urban zones. So there's this very heavy top-down narrative from the state that codifies space in particular ways. These are troubled areas. They're sensitive urban zones. They're zones of stigma. They're the banlieue. They're the outskirts, the outer lands. And what I was struck by was the people I was working with and interacting with every day having very powerful attachment to place and to community. No one was indifferent. It was not possible to be indifferent. Whether that meant they were angry, they were proud, whether they felt hostility and tension with their neighbors or forms of solidarity, and very complicated webs of relationships with the institutions around them, whether that's the police or schools or social services. And this was very strongly shaped by that heavy top-down French state that was labeling these spaces in particular ways, by public discourse, by media representations that sees people through a certain lens who have a particular postcode. That becomes a core part of identity, that it's like emblazoned on people's foreheads. I came back again to some of those areas when I started doing my doctoral research. Again, it was on something completely different. I was looking at, not completely different, but on debates over the headscarf and on secularism in France. And I went back to all of those areas again, these sensitive urban zones, and I learned all over again about those complex relationships that had been conditioned by flows of colonial migration, post-colonial migration, new forms of relationships with different forms of governments and with each other. And that story of stigma, but also of resisting stigma, of solidarity, pride, new forms of citizenship that people were constructing themselves. I also had the opportunity to do some interviews then with local officials where they would say, this is never going to happen again, this is done, no more. The next year, 2005, the uprisings, triggered by the death of two young men, Zayed Benan and Bouna Traoré, who died running from police. And there we started again thinking, well, what would it mean to represent these events differently? What would it mean to think and to speak and to listen differently about these forms of violence, these racialized forms of violence, particularly against young men? At the time I thought, well, there's not much I can do. It's not my country anyway. I stood by and I watched. I was angry, but I did nothing. And when the events of August 2011 happened in Tottenham, I took a different path because I just had enough of having that anger sit inside of me with no channel. I organized some events. I organized a public symposium bringing different groups of people together. I worked with the Citizen Journalism Trust to write a report about how young people had been represented in the media that found some resonance in policy circles. And what that led me to think about really then was, what's happening when we're telling these stories? Who's being heard? Who's being listened to? What kind of narratives are audible? What are the, just drawing from some of the sort of political theorists who influenced me a lot, in black feminism, in agonistic democratic theory, what are these norms of intelligibility and what identities then matter and speak in this intelligible kind of way? And what is the point then of the politics of listening? And I don't have time because Mette just flashed the card at me, but the point of that kind of politics for me has to be about political equality. That doesn't mean that we're all going to be equal. equal. It doesn't mean we're all going to be positioned equally with the same kinds of narrative resources. Because inevitably, the politics of social location are such that that's impossible. But we shouldn't all be so radically distorted. Some of us are radically distorted. Some of us have the ability to speak and be audible on terms more or less of our choosing, or terms that fit very well with our social location and circumstances. Others of us struggle to be heard unless we speak within very tight binaries. We speak in an us versus them. The riots happened in 2011. Oh, I'm not excusing that. I'm not excusing that. No, I'm just explaining it. That's a quote from Ed Miliband, then leader of the Labour Party. So these are the kinds of parameters then that we have to be thinking about if we want a politics of listening to be a form of solidarity. And the example I just wanted to raise with you very, very briefly in the time remaining is the opportunity I had in this book I just wrote. And I think here I'm supposed to pull the book out, I'm supposed to pull some flyers out, I'm supposed to pass them around to boost the sales. I'm not going to do that. But I just had the chance to finish this book where I was able to look at some examples of this kind of what I would call a moment of political equality, where listening can be an act of solidarity. Where some, and it's important to be clear about this, some, but not all migrant justice activists in what's referred to as Canada, especially the umbrella movement, No One Is Illegal, were able to work with, again, some, but not all, Indigenous activists in Canada to position themselves differently, to rethink what they had been claiming as migrant justice. Because until then, there's been this really heavy narrative in Canada, and I'm speaking to you as a Canadian, a daughter of economic migrants to Canada, where we position ourselves as this multicultural success story. That is our biggest export, multiculturalism. We've placed ourselves on the world stage as these purveyors of this successful ideology of multiculturalism. What that completely ignores, of course, is the founding violence and genocide on which Canada has been built. And migrant justice activists, especially racialized migrant activists, have done an incredibly good job in this group, No One Is Illegal, of rethinking this. As Harsha Walia, who's one of the main leaders of No One Is Illegal, fantastic scholar and activist, she talks about this as undoing border imperialism. And as she and others have very powerfully argued, criticizing themselves, educating themselves, taking direction, listening, and sticking around with Indigenous allies, is they thought to themselves, when we claim no borders, no nation, what does this mean for claims to Indigenous sovereignty? What does this mean for struggles for Indigenous justice? And what should this mean then for what we are calling migrant justice struggles? And that has led to a whole series of conversations, of listening as solidarity, where in a crazy way, the first step has been to stop talking and to listen, to take direction from Indigenous allies. And that's led to a reformulation of, again, some, but not all, migrant justice struggles in Canada. That's led to changing slogans. Instead of no borders, no nation, slogans like no one is illegal, Canada is illegal. But going beyond those kind of performative utterances, also to build new politics, to take on, for instance, to take seriously and study Indigenous host laws, Indigenous quote-unquote immigration law, to understand the relationship to land and sovereignty differently, not as a possession to acquire, but as perhaps a set of relationships in ways that, for those of us who are not Indigenous and steeped in that spirituality and those politics and that understanding, is very difficult to get our heads around. But that's part of the kind of conversation that some of these Indigenous justice activists have been trying to have, to rethink then their actions as well as their slogans. And I'm going to stop just by saying, for moments, and I'm not suggesting this has been a success, and you can hear, if you read that book chapter and you read some of the books, especially of Harsha Walia and her fellow activists in No One Is Illegal, that's led to misunderstandings, that's led to conflicts. It's not possible ever to understand the world as someone else does, as Susan Bickford and others argue who study the politics of listening as well. We can understand how others construct it for us, try to get our heads around where they're coming from, but it has led to moments of a kind of political equality where those narrative resources get redistributed, where there are moments of enacting different types of sovereignty and different types of political community. So I'll stop there. Thank you.